Good morning. My name is Debora Heard. I am the organizer for the William Leo Hansberry Society, and we're so happy to welcome you here to be with us this morning as we celebrate the third annual birthday celebration. Now, the William Leo Hansberry Society is a group of up-and-coming and established African and African-descended scholars who are committed to the studying and researching the early past of African societies. We're here to celebrate what would have been Professor William Leo Hansberry's 131st birthday on the 25th. And so today we are here engaging the topic, engaging Ethiopia. So we're looking at how Professor Hansberry viewed Ethiopia. So we've covered a lot of attention has been focused on the Nile Valley, but we decided that this year we return to looking at Ethiopia. So we have a very exciting program for you today, and we're just very honored that you chose to spend your time with us this morning. So this introductory panel that we will have, the program is divided into 3 panels. We have an introductory panel that will lay out the format for the rest of the discussion. We have a second panel that will discuss our recent ancestor, Reverend Dr. Gay Byron. And then the third panel is the main panel where we'll be talking about Ethiopia. So I'd like to invite my co-moderator for today, Brother Josef Ben Levi, to turn on his camera and to say hello.
All right, greetings everyone, and we're excited to have you all here for this third annual, actually is going to be the third Hansberry Symposium. We have a great program in store for you today, a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, and some great panelists, some amazing scholars, and we look forward to you participating and enjoy the conference.
And so I will briefly introduce Brother Ben Levi, as we call him. Having earned degrees from National Louis, Northeastern Illinois, and Lewis universities, Josef Ben Levi is a retired university professor whose interests include ancient and continental philosophy, African and African-American studies, education, sociology, curriculum and disability studies, ancient biblical, Egyptian, Nubian, and Gnostic literature. His language facilities include ancient Egyptian, Arabic, Aramaic, Coptic, French, Greek, Hieratic, Hebrew, Meroitic, and Spanish.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you very much. Now let me introduce my sister and my colleague, Debora Heard. Debora Heard is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago, specializing in Nubian archaeology. She began her study of Nubia in 2002 through her study of ancient Egyptian language and history in the Department of Egyptology. Her current research focuses on the inscriptions, iconography, and archaeology of the Kushite temples, in the regions of Napata and Meroe.
All right, thank you, Brother Ben. So our task for the next few minutes is to lay out Professor Hansberry's engagement with Ethiopia, both in the past, his contemporary time, and then also his vision for the future. So I guess I'll begin, first of all, by saying that Professor Hansberry was born in 1894 in Gloucester, Mississippi. And over time, and I'm not going to go through all of the background, but he became the first person in the United States to teach a curriculum of African studies at any university. And often Melville Herskovits is given that honor, but Professor William Leo Hansberry was teaching at Howard, a curriculum many years before he started, Melville Herskovits started at Northwestern. So one of the things that we want to do is to bring forth that history and to highlight his contributions because he's been overlooked for so long. But thinking about the way that he talks about Ethiopia because he began teaching at Howard in January of 1923, which is when he began teaching these African studies courses. And from the beginning, we discover that his engagement with Ethiopia, because he's coming from the classical text, there is a conflation between Ethiopia, the Greek and Roman Ethiopia, which actually we know was Kush and Nubia, and the Ethiopia of Abyssinia. So we see that early in his writings. And if you have the Pillars of Ethiopian History, the notebooks that were published, the 2 volumes, the first volume, Pillars in Ethiopian History, you can see that he's looking at, well, the second volume actually, that he's looking at Ethiopia as the Meroitic Kushite Ethiopia as opposed to Abyssinia. So I guess our discussion will start talking about that. So Ben, and you and I had discussion earlier in the week about, his engagement with the past. And when he began teaching, this was before, many decades before the earliest humans were found in Ethiopia. Omo 1, who is the earliest modern human, was not found until the 1970s by Richard Leakey. And even the older pre-humans like Dinkanesh or Lucy were not discovered until like 1970. But he understood that this research and study of the ancient past and early humans was in Africa. So he started off teaching about these early stone tool users. But as he went into talking about, the early civilizations or societies, and he was speaking about Ethiopia, he also understood, or he was engaging in a conversation basically with other Black scholars who had written about early Africa. So let's have that discussion first as we start.
Yes, thank you. I think that he's doing this because there are many people from the 19th century who are engaged in this study of ancient Africa, particularly, ancient Kush, ancient Nubia. We have people like Martin Robeson Delaney, who was a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, but very few people talk about him and his in his work on the Principia of Ethnology. You have Black women scholars like Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins in her One Blood, who's talking about this. Eliza Pendleton, who wrote a textbook for elementary school students, which has a whole section on ancient Nubia and Kush. And so you have so many of them. Of course, you have Professor Hansberry's colleague, Frank Snowden, who's writing in this area. And you have so many.
And actually, to kind of bring it back, because Snowden intersects with Hansberry kind of like in another area, because William Leo Hansberry, his father, who died when he was 3 years old, had been a classics professor at Alcorn State. So as he grew up, he and his brother inherited this library that his father had of these early classics. I should say European classics, so the Greek and Roman writers and historians. And so that's what he grew up reading. And I should take a pause right here because another important person's birthday is tomorrow, who was very influential in him getting started in this, and that is W.B. Du Bois.
Yes. Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
so when he was on summer break during his first year, after his first year of college at Atlanta University, he went back home to Mississippi to work, and he wrote and got this book that he saw that was being advertised in the Crisis, and it was Du Bois's book on Africa, and he said that he read that book that summer, and that opened this gate for him because he knew that Africa had a history, but he hadn't read anybody that had actually gone into that history. He had been reading it through the Greek and Roman lens. Um,
Yeah. In
so
fact, yeah, in
yeah, go
fact,
ahead.
that's why in his uh, second book, Africa and the Africans as Seen through the Classical Writers,
Hmm.
he goes through a whole litany of the early so-called classical writers, the Greeks, and they're talking about and mentioning what he referred to as Ethiopia, and he's talking about and Nubia in the most favorable light. Oftentimes, people study classics. I'm a person who taught philosophy for 18 years, and oftentimes, generally in philosophy departments, they don't even broach discussion in detail about the nature of Ethiopia as spoken by whether it's Herodotus or Aeschylus or Strabo or any of the others. Mentioned the subject, which lay a very strong foundation even in the United States during the early years, particularly in the study of African American students, where we had to learn the classics. They had to learn Greek. They had to read the classics in Greek. Of course, you had people like William Scarper, whom the Modern Language Society has an award that's given to physicists. And he was one of the first people to write an actual primer in Greek.
Ben, I think your microphone is kind of cutting out.
Is that right? How about now?
Okay, that's
Yeah,
better.
yeah. He was one. William Scarborough was one of the first scholars who write a book, a primer on Greek language to be used in schools African Americans were going to, because
Your
that
your
was
your microphone is doing the thing
going in
again.
and out.
Yeah.
Well, let me just briefly say that he was a very, very important person, uh, and we need to study him more. And for those who don't have his work, I recommend that you buy them.
So yeah, so I kind of brought us back to that particular time period because I also wanted to engage a couple of other writers, and you mentioned Frank Snowden, which is why I kind of stopped you there because Blacks in antiquity. So he's looking at um, the way that Blacks are portrayed in the Greek and Roman writings, but also one person that's really kind of she was ahead of her time, but she was focused on these writings was Drusilla Dungy Houston or
Yes.
Drusilla Dungy Houston,
Hmm.
wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire. So these are some of the early writers that um, he knows about. And so the research at that time, um, when you're looking at Ethiopia and looking at early African societies, a lot of people were kind of stuck looking at the text, those Greek and Roman writers. And so Hansberry is one that kind of breaks out of that mold because he's trained as an anthropologist. So he looks at Ethiopia, which is actually Kush and Merowe, from the written record, but then he also begins to look at the archaeology. And that's where he kind of breaks the mold and goes into a different direction. So then he begins to tease out the difference between Ethiopia in the European classical writers and Ethiopia as in Abyssinia and looking at
Hmm.
that history. So I think that that's a very important distinction to make. But because the archaeology was not very progressive at that time, it had progressed to the point where we have um, scholars like we have today. The transition to looking at Ethiopia, the Ethiopia that we know, is more focused on the Christianization.
Hmm.
And so we see Christian Ethiopia coming into play. So the first kind of interaction we have is with King Azena,
Hmm.
right? Where he can't is basically seen as the king that comes in and conquers Merowe, and that's supposedly the end of the Merowitic uh Meroitic kingdom in Nubia, Kush. But he also talks about, Frumentius. So he's delves into that kind of Christian history of Ethiopia. And so we have the Queen of Sheba.
Hmm.
That's in that first volume.
Right.
Then their discussion about Prester John. But what he's doing is going back almost he's doing a history of Ethiopia almost from an Ethiopian or ruling Ethiopian perspective,
Hmm.
because he's digging into that Solomonic line of
Hmm.
rulers, right? So he's looking at Ethiopia as a Christian kingdom and its rise. So, but he's also beginning to see the archaeology, because the archaeology is just, towards the end of his career at Howard is when a lot of the archaeology is taking off in Ethiopia. So he's beginning to integrate that.
Hmm.
But I guess the last thing, because we have to tie this up really quickly, um, so that's his research engagement with the past, but his contemporary engagement with Ethiopia is also important because he has develops this relationship with Ethiopia. He's involved in starting the African American Institute, which is now the Africa America Institute,
Hmm.
with Horace Mann Bond, who was the president of Lincoln University. He was a historian, also the father of Julian Bond.
Hmm.
They founded that organization, but he also founded the Ethiopian Research Council, which I think is really important, to kind of point out, with Ralph Bunche.
Hmm.
But there was also another person that was involved. It was a Ethiopian student that had come over to the United States to study medicine, and he was at Howard at the time, and so he was engaged in working with Professor Hansberry. He also helped to found the Ethiopian Research Council. So that's a really interesting point, and I don't have his name. I wrote it down, but I've got all these pieces of paper around me. Um, but I wanted to point that out. But we had a very interesting discussion about that, and hopefully your microphone is
Yeah. Yeah. We're good. How about that? We're good? Yes.
okay.
Yeah. Um, I think that, and I know we have a short time left, and I want to kind of sum this up by saying that for those of you who are here at the symposium, this is an example. Speaking of Debora Heard here presenting, this is an example of the type of scholarship we have in the Hansberry Society and the types of scholars you will be introduced to today who will be presenting to you. And so we look forward to you enjoying and having an exciting symposium with us.
All right, but that's without what I was trying to hint at.
I know.
So we had talked about the fact that um, when the Ethiopian Research Council was formed, it was really in response to the Italian aggression, the attempt to invade Ethiopia, and African Americans were, um, very involved. They were watching what was going on in Ethiopia.
Yes, they were.
And in New York, people started actually signing up. African Americans were lined up to sign up to go over to Ethiopia
Yep, yes, they
to
were.
fight against Italy on behalf of Ethiopia. So, and some people actually did go. But the Ethiopian Research Council was formed about this time. And the discussion that you and I had was about Marcus Garvey,
Yes.
because Marcus Garvey was very key about that, motivating people to want to go and fight on behalf of the Ethiopians.
Hmm.
But the tie-in there is that right before William Leo Hansberry went to Howard University, so he was at Straight College in New Orleans, which is now Dillard, from
Yes.
1920 to 1921. 21, 22, he was on a break at Harvard doing research. So he had a fellowship, but during that time, he was also touring the South and the East Coast, um, talking about African history because he felt that all of the HBCUs should be teaching African history and African studies, and also school teachers. So he was making a tour of all these cities throughout the South and along the East Coast, and he came across, or he got the ear of Marcus Garvey.
Yes.
So when Howard was recruiting him, and Atlanta University was trying to recruit him to come to Atlanta to teach, Marcus Garvey was also in the mix because he wanted Hansberry to come as an instructor for the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So he ended up, we know that he chose to go to Howard, but I just thought it was very interesting that Marcus Garvey was interested in what he had to say. And so we have this tie-in again later when people are signing up to go to Ethiopia to fight. Um, William Leo Hansberry is one of those people that's there,
Right.
helping to form this Ethiopia Research
Right,
Council.
you're correct. We did have a discussion on that, and I think that the whole history of the relationship between William Leo Hansberry and Marcus Garvey is often overlooked
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the role that William Leo Hansberry played in the producing. Because as powerful, as important as Garvey was, it's apparent that he was kind of lacking in some of the things you know about the history of Africa, and that's where William Leo Hansberry comes in and plays a role, and why he wanted him to come and do lectures at the UNIA headquarters, Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League headquarters in
Mm-hmm.
Harlem, New York.
Yeah.
So yeah, the man had a major, major role and influence on people. And I can think of many people. I mean, one of my former teachers, the great uh, Dr. John Henry Clark,
Mm-hmm.
was one of his students.
Right.
Chancellor Williams
Mm-hmm.
was one of his students. Uh, Ande Ezekwe
Right.
was one of his students. Kwame Nkrumah was
Mm-hmm.
one of his students. So we don't get a chance to know the significance of why these people's uh, African philosophy was developed because of their experience sitting in classes. William Leo Hansberry.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that these things are very interesting. Thank you, because we did talk about that. It's just you
Right.
know,
All right. So it's time for us to move on to our next panel. Solange and Salim, I'll invite you to turn your cameras on, and Brother Ben, we'll see you shortly. All right. And let me pull this up right quick while we're going through this. Right. So this next panel is basically a tribute to our recent ancestor, Reverend Dr. Gay Byron. Dr. Byron, I had the pleasure of meeting in October of 2023, and you see that she passed away that year. I was at Howard um, actually for an interview, and it just so happened that they were also celebrating the 70th anniversary of African Studies at Howard. So they had a program, and I happened to run in, and that was actually the first time I was actually able to meet Miss Gail Hansberry in person. She was there. But this woman comes up to me and she knew who I was. She was like, "Are you Debora Heard?" And I was like, "Yes." And so she introduced herself. And I'm humbled in the aftermath to to know that she knew who I was. But we had a discussion, and she had just won. She was off on sabbatical, and she had won a grant that allowed her to do research. She was researching uh, early Christianity using Ethiopic text. And so we had this long discussion. And when she told me what she was doing, I was like, oh, I have to get you in touch with Helina Woldekiros and Kevin Burrell. And it just so happened Helena was in Ethiopia at the time, so she didn't get to connect with her. But Kevin, on several occasions, tried to reach out to her. They kept missing each other, and it just so happened that in late December, well, early December actually, I saw something about they were having a prayer vigil for her, and then a couple of days later she passed away. But I just felt like it was such. I had met her just that one time, and we communicated over email a couple of times, but she made just this very deep impression upon me. And I was very interested in her work, the work that she was trying to do, and I saw that we would have had a long-term working engagement together if she had lived. So I just felt like it was such a loss. It was just a tremendous loss for me. I felt it deeply, even having known her for that short time. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Solange. So she has her own slide to show, and then Salim.
All right, I am going to share my slide. Let's see. And tell you a little bit about my experience knowing Reverend Dr. Gail Byron. She reached out to me, I would say probably late 2021. And we corresponded right up until 6 days before she passed. So I just want to acknowledge that she was professor of the New Testament and early Christianity at Howard University School of Divinity. The book of hers that I'm most familiar with is Symbolic Blackness, an Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature, in which she explores the intersection of race and ethnicity in early Christian writings. Fabulous book that coincidentally I was reading at the time of Gay's passing. But she reached out to me because she was starting to delve into the Candace or the Meroitic Kandake, these powerful queen mothers from the kingdom of Meroe, and showed me a publication that she was working on, wanting to confirm that she had gotten her facts right. And in fact, she's an amazing scholar, citing many of the folks working in the field, including our own Dr. Salim Faraji. And then we met in person in Washington, D.C. on May 6, 2022. And really started talking about her research into these Ethiopic manuscripts that Deb just mentioned.
Excuse me, Solange, I apologize. We can see your presenter notes.
Oh, sorry. That's okay. Is it all right if I just leave it like this?
If that's what you prefer, go ahead, do your
It's
thing.
all right. I'm gonna just do it like this.
Sounds
I'll just wrap up by saying that she had recently won a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to undertake a study of Duke University's collection of Ethiopic manuscripts, and we were really hoping to partner on such research. And I am just really sad to have lost a friend and a really important collaborator. So I just wanted to share this image of Gay and I when we first met on a rainy May day at Sankofa bookstore in Washington, D.C., just up the street from Howard University. I just want to say, Ankti, may she live, and call her name Reverend Dr. Gay L. Byron Ma'a Heru, true of voice. Go ahead, Salim. I'll yield the floor.
Okay, and before Salim goes, I kind of messed up the little script here that I have in my hand, so I was supposed to introduce you, Solange. So I'll just do that quickly. The person that you just heard from was Solange Ashby. who is an assistant professor of Egyptology and Nubian Studies at UCLA. She received her PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. Her first book, Calling Out to Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Philae, was published in 2020. Her current research explores the roles of women in traditional Nubian religious practices and the history, religious symbolism, and political power of the queens of Kush. So thank you, Solange. And I'll turn it over to Salim. I won't be introducing Salim because he's on the main panel and he will be introduced with the other speakers.
All right, how is everyone this morning? Also, this afternoon, for those of you who are on the East Coast, in the Midwest, good to see you all. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to join my Hansberry Society colleagues. Before we began this morning, I'm just looking at, and many of those photos I had seen, I was just looking at the carousel of slides, and I was like, wow, the William Leo Hansberry Society. I'm proud of the work that we've been doing in our organization for the past 5 years. I only have a couple slides. I should say only because they're significant for Dr. Gay Byron as I provide just some brief remarks regarding her. Okay. I've been knowing Dr. Gay Byron for 20 years, 2004 at least, and I'm trying to remember even if it was before that, even if it was 2000, but I know definitely 2004. And the reason why I'm playing with those dates is because while I was in graduate school, right, and my background, part of my background is in theological studies and religious studies. And philosophical scholarship. So, I attended seminary at Claremont School of Theology, which is why I moved here to Southern California 30 years ago to attend Claremont School of Theology. And then, I would do graduate work in PRT, philosophy, religion, and theology. And then, of course, history, right? Those are my two areas. And so there's an organization in Atlanta that's been around, I think, since the 1950s or 60s. It used to be called the Fund for Theological Education, right? So if there are any emerging scholars or undergrads who are on this just listening and you think you want to do theological scholarship, religious studies, and philosophy, you must know about the Fund for Theological Education. Maybe about 10 years ago or more, the name was changed to the Forum for Theological Education. And so while I was in graduate school, I actually was both a North American doctoral fellow and a dissertation fellow for the Forum for Theological Education, right? So I'm a FTE alumni. But the North American doctoral fellowship, I was awarded $5,000, right? And then the dissertation fellowship, I was awarded $15,000, right? That might have been about 4 or 5 years apart. When I start dissertating is when you get the doctoral fellow. And so Dr. Byron was a mentor in the FTE program. That's how I met her. That's how I engaged. In fact, the point of that program was to put emerging theological scholars, religious studies scholars, into conversation with established scholars. And so she was one among many others who are in like Black religious scholarship, Black theological studies, and so forth. And so the earliest date I remember is 2004, because 2004 FTE, we had a seminar at the University of Notre Dame, right? And so I was hanging out with her. Who else? Dr. Hugh Page, who's still at Notre Dame. Anthony Penn, who's at University of Houston, if I'm not mistaken. Michael Joseph Brown, who's now the president of Payne Theological Seminary. He used to be on faculty at Emory University in Atlanta and so forth. And so I met Gay Byron then, and I remained in touch with her because out of all of the scholars that I just mentioned, she was the one that was focusing, as you all could see and of course, Dr. Ashby highlighted this as well. Her book, Symbolic Blackness and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature, right? And so I relied heavily on her work, heavily on her scholarship in my book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, and of course, cited her and so forth. And so she had a tremendous impact on me, from 2004 even up until she passed in December 23. We would periodically remain in touch, even when she went to Howard. And so she was at Howard for a while. And I had spent a year at Howard Divinity School before I transferred to Claremont. And so I always stayed in touch with her, right? We always send each other messages on social media, Facebook, or whatever. Of course, as Dr. Ashby mentioned, she was involved in a project at Duke called The Invisible Lives of Ethiopian Manuscripts. And also she's working on a project, Hidden in Plain Sight, Ethiopic Manuscripts and Early Christianity, right? Which is, two very important areas of research that she was focusing on. Because oftentimes, of course, in the Western world, and myself being trained in part as an early Christian specialist, we do not look at the development of early Christianity from the perspective of Ethiopian manuscripts or Ethiopian history and so forth. And of course, my specialization, which is Coptic and Nubian studies as well. And so Dr. Byron was a part of that conversation in regard to Ethiopian manuscripts and so forth. I just wanted to share, I think this is a message she sent to me actually on Facebook. Out of the clear blue as well, right? This was like 216, 217. And I'm sharing this because, again, I was relying on Dr. Byron, Symbolic Blackness and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature. And so for a decade later, for her to be then engaging my work, right? And she was my mentor, and say she's using my work in one of her classes. She said, Salim, right? This Facebook message, I'm using your book in my African Christianity course this week at Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry. The students have been transformed and taken to a new level of awareness and commitment. Thank you for the excellent scholarship and for sharing your story and the stories of those on whom shoulders we stand. Blessings, yay. So I was excited again to receive this message, right? It's in any profession, maybe even athletics, football, basketball, right? In any profession, when the teacher acknowledges the student and says, I'm now using your work, we all look forward to that. I look forward to having conversations like that with my students. And I've had conversations like that with students I've had who are now professors, who are now hold PhDs in various disciplines, right? That's a joy as a professor to be able to reciprocate that to a person who was once your student. And so the relationship I had with Dr. Byron, of course, right, was very encouraging and supportive. And so like Dr. Ashby, she now dwells in the company of the immortals, those who have no names. May she be declared Ma'a Keru, true of word and true of deed and true of voice, right? Ashe Yebo to Dr. J.L. Byron. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim, and thank you, Solange, for your reflections. I thought it was important for us to pause to do that because when we're looking at Professor Hansberry's work, we've looked at his engagement with the past and the present, which was his contemporary present. But we also have to look at how he was engaging for the future. And so one of the things that we know is that for him, primary research was important. He wasn't able to do the research that he wanted. He had a lot of obstacles, but he knew to advance the work that primary research was important. So Reverend Dr. Gay Byron was one of those people who was about to really do that work on Ethiopia. So she was definitely a person that was in keeping with William Leo Hansberry's vision of the future. So this third panel, which is the main panel, takes up that topic of the vision of Ethiopia, primary research for the future. So for that, I will invite Yonatan and Helina to turn on their cameras, and Ben, who will be introducing them, and I will step out.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Deb. A wonderful panel of scholars we have right here and Hansberry Society members. I'm going to read each of their short bios we have here, and then we're going to let them do what they do. First, Helina. Helina Woldekiros is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. She is a specialist in African archaeology and agricultural systems, focusing on the complex trade networks and economic systems of the Horn of Africa for the past 5,000 years. He is the author of The Boundaries of Ancient Trade, Kings, Commoners, and the Aksumite Salt Trade of Ethiopia from University Press, Colorado, 2023. I recommend that you buy it. It's an excellent book. Her research focuses on ancient trade routes that connected Africa and Asia, livestock biodiversity, and traditional resource management systems. Currently, she is investigating human-environment interaction and food webs in highland Ethiopia, integrating archaeological evidence with indigenous knowledge to understand long-term patterns of ecological resilience. Her work contributes significantly to our understanding of sustainable agricultural practices, economic resilience in ancient and modern contexts. Next, Salim Faraji, whom you just heard. He is professor and chair of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is also the founding executive director of the Masters of Arts in International Studies Africa program at Concordia University, Irvine in Ghana, West Africa. He specializes in early Christian history, Africana and Africanist historiography, ancient Egyptian religion, Coptic studies, and the Kerma, Napata, Meroitic, and medieval periods of Nubian history. Salim is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of African Religion, the Oxford Dictionary of African Biography, and more recently, Life Under the Baobab Tree, Africana Studies and Religion in the Traditional Age and New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia. He is also author of The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh, which again, I recommend that you buy. Finally, Yonatan Binyam is assistant professor of ancient Mediterranean and Ethiopic studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Culture at UC Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley. He previously was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, in addition to receptions of ancient Greek and Latin works in medieval Ethiopic literature. His research also focuses on the problem of modern categories like race, racism, religion, and ethnicity as analytical terms in studies of the ancient Mediterranean world. He is currently preparing 2 monographs. The first monograph deals with the question of race, racism, and anti-Semitism in antiquity in view of the recent scholarship on the use of these categories in studies of the pre-modern. Second book project provides philological and literary analysis selected those from the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Judeo-Arabic, Arabic, and Ge'ez text that constitute the chain of transmission from Josephus' Jewish Wars to the Hebrew Sefer Yosiphon and the Ge'ez Zena Ayub, that is the history of the Jews. These are our panelists. We look forward to welcoming them in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Levi, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to the session. I want to first thank the organizers for, again, getting us all together and to be part of this historical moment. I cannot thank enough Debora and Solange for their hard work, Jasmine, everyone. I'm really excited that we're covering Ethiopia in this session in the spirit of Professor William Leo Hansberry. And I'm really humbled to be here, actually, and to present my work, my humble work that I've been doing in the past few years in Ethiopia. So my research interest is mostly looking at how ancient people made a living, how they used resources, and how this resource consumption contributed to the beginning of early social, economic, and political organization. So today I'm going to present my old project and my new project in Ethiopia. The first one, Aksumite Afar Salt Trade, and the second one, Kafa Forest Management. So I'm basically interested in how people used common pooled resources like salt and forest in the ancient past. So key questions my team and I ask in this really important human past in the Horn of Africa is, how did ancient societies develop sustainable systems for managing shared resources? What role did resource management play in shaping social and political structures? And finally, how did different communities negotiate access to valuable common pool resources like salt and forest? And I use a very integrated methodology. I use archaeology, ethnoarchaeology, historical text, and local traditional knowledge. So it's a very community engaged project that I do for both my projects in the Horn of Africa. I'm not going to go through the theoretical framework of what common pool resource is, but key aspect of common pool resource in the past is that they're very exclusionary. So it's hard to prevent other people from accessing them or using them, and it requires a complex social arrangement to manage and access common pool resources like salt deposits and forests and grazing lands. And this is not only in Ethiopia, but anywhere in the world. They're really highly subtractable. Again, used by one person or by a group might completely diminish the resource, hence requiring community engaged resource management, a lot of social negotiation, getting along with different community groups, people who speak different languages, different approaches to their surroundings. So that's why I'm very interested in looking at how common pool resource actually structured the organization of ancient societies in the Horn of Africa or Northeast Africa, because as you know, Ethiopia is the origin of so many things, including our human species. But like today, I'll introduce one of the commodities, but in order to survive thousands of years, they needed to create this important social organization and political structure that let them access this resource without conflict. And I'm interested in how they avoided conflict, but also how they managed to conserve this resource for thousands of years without over exploiting it. Again, looking at traditional knowledge today will help us understand, even conserve whatever resource we have left on Earth. So again, I love to have my project speak to our future as well. So that's the theoretical background. So I'm going to again show you how two different communities, but all of them found in Ethiopia, managed to use parallel resources and come up with really important ways to manage, and get along for thousands of years in the Ethiopian highlands. So my first site is the Aksumites. They're found in the northern highlands of Ethiopia. So we're going to move there before we go down south. So as you can see, the Aksumites were located in the northern Ethiopian Eritrean highlands in a well-water green highland area, close to the extremely dry desert lowlands of the Danakil Depression, where we have resources like salt and obsidian. Just to give you a background, I know most of you here know about the pre-Aksumite and Aksumites of ancient Ethiopia, but they were considered to be pioneers in so many things in Ethiopia. Like Debora mentioned earlier, King Ezan of the Aksumites introduced Christianity to Ethiopia, but of course, more complex history than that. We also have the earliest architecture emerging in the Horn of Africa during the pre-Aksumite and Aksumite period. There were so many manis during the pre-Aksumite and Aksumite of Ethiopia. We have the development of a writing system, the Ge'ez script, Ethiopic script happening during the Aksumite period, metalworking, advanced agriculture, and different technologies emerging during this time. The famous stele of the Aksumite, as you can see in the picture, was again part of this period. It's a four-door, four-window stele, beautiful architecture for the burial places of the kings and queens. They minted coins, different minerals, built beautiful houses, palaces. So the Aksumite and pre-Aksumites were again an important part of the Horn of African story. Most of the wealth of the Aksumites came from agriculture, but they were also important traders. Their location in the Horn of Africa made them a strong competitor with ancient powers like Rome, Mediterranean world like Persians. So they were located at very strategic locations and were exporting different types of commodities from the hinterland of Africa, like obsidian, gold, ivory, so many wild animal ivories and exotic goods. They were also importing mostly elite luxury goods back to Ethiopia. So these are where some of the resources that we know from pre-Aksumite and Aksumite period, which shows a very well-established local resource management system that helped contribute to the establishment of this complex society in the Northern Horn of Africa. So as you can see on the map, the Danakil salt trade represents one of history's most remarkable example of sustainable resource management. The trade routes that traversed this extreme terrain, crossing altitude difference of over 3,000 meters from the Afar lowlands to the Ethiopian highlands, which is again a challenging geography, required a very elaborate cooperation between highland and lowland communities. And of course, the main salt source for the Aksumite was the Afar Desert. The Afar salt route again contributed mostly for the development of this thriving highland agriculture. So again, just to give you some quantitative statistics to show you the enormous amount of salt that was mined and continued to be mined until present day from the Danakil Depression. You can see the trade routes crosses about 220 kilometers, carrying about 100,000 to 200,000 tons of salt, carried by about 70,000 animals per year. The main source of the salt is Lake Asale in the Danakil Depression. Again, this is one of the few sources of salt for the Ethiopian highland and the Horn of Africa. But this gives you a general idea of the amount of resource that we have in the Danakil Depression. So the Aksumites, they're highlanders, they're not found in isolation. They're right next to their lowland Afar mobile pastoralists. And just to give you a background about the Afar pastoralists, the Afar people are, dependent on their livestock and salt extraction, and they lived in this challenging environment on Earth. Their social organization was based on flexible property concepts and communal resource management, allowing them to adapt to both environmental challenges and changing political circumstances. And whenever an outsider came to access salt, they have to abide by the local rule, which is very friendly, which is, sharing resource, communal resource, whether you're a stranger or whether you're an Afar. So the Afar, because they're mobile pastoralists, unlike the Aksumites, we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence, dotting the environment. What we do have is so many burial places, mostly in the form of rock circles of the mobile pastoralists, because of their work belief about, sharing resource and moving around the environment, letting the environment regenerate itself, allowed for this lack of, standing architecture, except the burial places. But nevertheless, there are so many traces of the Afar on the landscape, whether we look at the trade routes or goods they were exchanging, like obsidian or salt, with their neighbors. And this is a big project. And if you're interested in reading more about it, I'm shamelessly promoting my book. Please, read my book on that. But to just give you again a little bit of my finding together with my team from this book is that based on the archaeological survey and excavation, it's very clear that there's a carefully planned route, rest stops, and trading posts that facilitated this complex network. The material culture from both the highland and lowland context demonstrate the deep integration of these different communities using the salt trade system. And this is a GIS map that I did. I took GPS points working with modern day salt caravanners and used known Aksumite and pre-Aksumite sites to see, how this networks functioned even in the past. And you can see there was a very well thought out strategy to use this common wealth or resource with their lowland neighbors. So moving on to quickly talk about now my second site, which I just started. So I literally came back 2 weeks ago from excavation. So this is a very new project, and I'm going to give you some highlights. So most of you might not have heard of the Kafa Kingdom. Again, this is in the southern highlands of Ethiopia. Going back to the map again here, located here. So while, again, most people know a lot about the Aksumites, I thought it was time to also introduce the other kingdoms that emerged in the Ethiopian highlands and lowlands. So what happened in Ethiopia, again, since Ethiopia was the origin of so many things, there were so many independent segmentary states emerging with different cultures, different languages within that small area. It's only in the 18th century that we see the unification or a unitary system or state emerging in Ethiopia. So we have so many kingdoms and states that emerged, and one of them is the Kafa Kingdom. And why is it important to study Kafa? There are so many whys. One is, this is the kingdom that gave coffee to the world. So coffee Arabica was introduced by the Kafa Kingdom. So the word coffee comes from the word Kafa. So this particular culture, again, different from the extreme desert highland of the Afar, we have an extreme highland green forest. And people have been protecting this forest for thousands of years using traditional knowledge. So they were well aware of their environment and the importance of conserving this very important ecosystem, to the extent that now the Kafa forest is recorded UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So this is one of the networks of global protected forests that provide clean air for us. So it's considered the oxygen of the world. So this is a very important site, not only for Ethiopia, but the world, because of this traditional belief about protecting forests and preserving it for the future, we have this amazing site, but also a community that developed a very important agricultural system. One of them is domesticating coffee and introducing it to the globe. So this is my new site, another highland, beautiful highland. I'll show you more pictures. Just to give you a background about the Kaffa Kingdom. So the Kingdom of Kaffa emerged as a powerful state in southwestern Ethiopia. It's known for establishing one of the most complex indigenous kingdoms. This is considered, again, like other East African iron-making kingdoms, home again to the origin of coffee and origin of a very unique, beautiful architectural style as well. So the political capital of the Kaffa Kingdom emerged at the modern city of Bonga. So this is where the political seat was located. These are some of the pictures I took recently. So again, emphasizing the importance of the Kaffa Kingdom is the contribution of this very complex administrative system, which I'll talk about in a little while. Very democratic parliament system, really earlier on in medieval time. We have unique craft tradition, pottery, metalwork emerging here as well. Of course, the trade network was also very important, hence introduction of coffee to the world. So the economic power of the Kaffa Kingdom, again, was dependent on so many trade networks, not only coffee, but they were involved in medieval gold trade, forest products, ivory, enslaved people. Again, I will not cover all of them today, just to give you a highlight. And we also know a little bit about the royal burials of the Kaffa Kingdom. At least for 18 of the burial places are very well guarded today. Different architecture compared to the Northern Highlands, as you can see in the picture. Specific clan group are responsible for guarding the burial places. They're considered a sacred area, religious place. So their ancestors are considered as powerful in this region. Unlike the Northern Highlands, there's a strong African religion dominant in this region in the past and including today. Here is the gate of the burial places. We were only allowed to take pictures, again, peeking through the things. No one is allowed inside the burial place today. So my project is called the Kaffa Biocultural Landscape Archaeology Project. Some of the research questions we're exploring are together with the community. So we went there not only to impose our research agenda, but we asked the community, what do you want archaeology to do for you? And one question they have is, we want to know our origin. So we only have information starting from medieval Kaffa Kingdom because of the introduction of writing system into that region, but archaeology can tell us more about ancient Kaffa using non-textual evidence as well. So they want to know the origin of the Minjo clan, for example, different migrations of people in that area, Islamic, Christian religions, their connection to their neighboring states, their early settlement pattern, and most importantly, the origin of agriculture in that area. So first thing I did is survey last year And 2 weeks ago, we did the first test excavation, and we're very excited about our result. So we excavated and surveyed both elite and non-elite contexts. So the non-elite context is mostly to understand the beginning of agriculture and how non-elites used common pool resources and the different management strategies they developed. So we did a lot of survey and mapping. There are tons of places. It's a very green area. There's rain 9 months of the year, so that's why it's always green and very lush. So it's always raining. As you can see in the background, there's another important plant that was domesticated in the Kafa Kingdom, the Inset plant, which is again another indigenous, very rich food in southwest Ethiopia. So these are some of the forest and non-elite sites we're exploring, including rock shelters, beautiful caves, again, places where, different types of indigenous farming is practiced. So the second site is an elite site. This is where the political seat of the kings were. This is more like a parliament, administrative palace site. The site, again, is called Bongi Shamicho. And you can see the view. All of the sites, the elite sites, are on top of a mountain. Beautiful view, 360 degrees. It's just working there is a great pleasure. Just the view from morning to evening is unbelievable. So this is, again, the mounds we found at the site of Bongi Shamicho. Again, our survey team taking points, all the time, and you can see the background, the highland plateau of southwestern Ethiopia. There's nothing like being on site, so that's why I'm sharing pictures so you can really see the Ethiopian highlands. So the third site was the palace of the last king of Kafa. His name was Tatogaki Shericho. This is, again, a very important site. We did test excavation, and it's a very deep site. We will go back to the site many, many years because we've been finding a lot of interesting artifacts. So this is the first pit that we excavated. So our excavation is the first one to actually taste the Kafa Kingdom ever in southwest Ethiopia, again, following Professor Hansberry's tradition of doing primary work. There are more heritage sites around this palace. One of them is post-Christianity churches, Ethiopian Orthodox Church, really early painting for that region. There are churches in this area earlier than this. This is 150 years old, so considered young compared to medieval churches in southwest Ethiopia. Just to show you again, painting within this building, all of the paint colors were made from local plant organic material, and they lasted 150 years. So our goal is, again, to quickly wrap up, to integrate not only the archaeological record, but to use ethnoarchaeology, community knowledge, respect traditional knowledge when we write this history, and include community voices. So our main goal is to do a very community-engaged, collaborative work in Kafa region. So the lesson learned from the Afar project and the Kafa project is that it shows, a very complex indigenous system for managing common pool resource emerged in the Horn of Africa that lasted over 1,000 years, and revealing complex relationship between state and local actors, non-elite and elite collaboration, highlanders and lowland pastoralists, settled agriculturalists, and forest hunter-gatherers. So our role is to unravel this complex resource management system, collaboration between these different communities, which also included, again, religious practices, economic networks like trade routes, that were local and global, and we hope to use our models for future understanding of modern resources and conservation, especially forest conservation and precious resources like salt, and how we can conserve that for future generation. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'm a second hello, and then looking forward to the questions.
Salim, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I was just waiting for the, the moderator's cue, but I'm ready.
You can go ahead.
All right. All right, great. Let me thank Dr. Woldekiros for her presentation. Excellent. I could have sat and just continued to listen to your presentation, especially the dimension where you were talking about the Kappa kingdom. And I just think that's important because it kind of destroys any monolithic perspective that we may have of Ethiopia. So I'm actually proud to be on this panel with both Dr. Binyam and Dr. Woldekiros, two specialists in Ethiopian history and archaeology and anthropology and so forth. In fact, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, I got an email from another colleague inquiring about an Ethiopian Bible. So I know, I said, well, let me just send Dr. Binyam an email, and he graciously responded. So again, I just wanted to acknowledge both my my colleagues on this panel this afternoon. I come to Ethiopia not necessarily as a specialist exclusively in Ethiopian studies and history, but you can focus on ancient Nubia and even ancient Egypt, and even the later periods, such as medieval Libya and the Coptic Church, and not talk about Ethiopia. And so my encounter with Ethiopia, aside just from being interested in the history of the civilizations and kingdoms and nations in that part of Africa, it is also rooted in my own scholarship on ancient Nubia. Okay, this afternoon, I'm looking at really at the Aksumite period, especially the rise of the Aksumite kingdom of Izana. Even here you see AD or CE 300, right? So from the 4th to the 8th century, which is the period I'm looking at, a period when the Aksumite kingdom in the region of Ethiopian highlands make the transformation or quote unquote conversion to Christianity. Again, in my work, especially the book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, I was looking at a number of issues. One, the encounter that King Izana describes, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, with the Noba people, or the Nubians, or the Nubadians. That's number one. And of course, the relationship between the Coptic Church in Egypt as well as Ethiopia, and we'll talk about that as well. And then even the conflicts, if you will, between Aksum and the states that emerged in the Middle Nile Valley that we know as ancient Kush, and then in the later periods, ancient Libya. And so I have, of course, these maps, the one to the left, which just gives a general overview of the geographical expanse, if you will, of the Aksumite kingdom. And in this particular map, you see that the influence even extends into South Arabia, dealing with two kingdoms, actually, Saba, or the Sabaeans, as well as Himyar, or the Himyarites. And so we'll be looking at that as well. Of course, the civilization of Aksum, or modern-day Ethiopia, in the northern part of the country, is a civilization that I sparingly address in my book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, focusing on this ancient mystical Christianity, the oldest in the world after Egypt and Armenia. But even Aksum's predecessors, Demat, is the birthplace of Ge'ez, or Ethiopic, a language that is contemporary with Canaanite or Phoenician in the Levant, as well as the parent, along with Phoenician, of Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and etc. And of course, as has been alluded to earlier, some of Ethiopia is also home to some of the earliest skeletal remains of hominins, the early predecessors, human ancestors that date back to 3.5 million years ago, which was found, and which Dr. Woldekiros mentioned in the great Dankill depression there, the remains of Lucy, as he is called. I also want to highlight a global perspective, and of course, this is a very famous work put out in late antiquity, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and it gives insight into the trade networks that connected the Levant with the Nile Valley, as well as the Arabian Peninsula, and as you all see, even as far east as India. And so this was to use the Greek term, this was an ecumenate, right? This was or even use our contemporary language, this was a form of globalization in late antiquity, with trade routes that connected easily from Byzantium, also Rome, of course, the Horn of Africa, or Aksum, well into India, and even into Southeast Asia. So the Periplus Maris Erythraea, or the voyage of the Erythraean Sea, which is what the Red Sea was called, is an anonymous work from around the middle of the 1st century, written by a Greek-speaking Egyptian merchant. The first part of the work describes the maritime trade routes following the north-south axis from Egypt down to the east coast of Africa, as far as modern-day Tanzania. And so this text also mentions revisiting areas as far south as Tanzania. And certainly when the Arab powers, Islam, begins to emerge, they actually usurp these pre-existing trade routes that have been established in the Nile Valley, the Levant, Mediterranean, and also in this civilization in India. The remainder describes the routes of the east-west axis running from Egypt around the Arabian Peninsula, past the Persian Gulf, on to the west coast of India, of course. Agilis is an archaeological site situated in the northern Red Sea region. It was the port of the kingdom of Aksum and the gateway of trade to the Eritrean hinterlands. Agilis is described in the 1st century Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It controls, it allowed Aksum to control the trade routes in this particular region, what is now the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and of course, the Mediterranean. This is important to understand the influence of Aksum and the interactions that it had with other regional powers at that time. And in fact, the prophet who is the founder of Manichaeism from what is now modern day Iran, right? This is a famous quote of his. He says, there are 4 great kingdoms on earth, right? And he's writing in the 3rd century CE. The first is the kingdom of Babylon and Persia. The second is the kingdom of Rome. The third is the kingdom of the Aksumites. The fourth is the kingdom of the Chinese, right? So of course, this is his perspective, his assessment. But considering that Mani's work spread from Iran into the Nile Valley, there's been Manichaean manuscripts that have been discovered in Upper Egypt and have been viewed as influencing even the Nag Hammadi collection that was discovered there in 1945. And so this is a perspective of someone who viewed Aksum as one of the 4 powers in the world, especially according to the map that I showed you dealing with the Erythraean Sea. Now I want to move to the famous victory stele of the Aksumite king Ezana. And I do deal with this topic in my book, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, in relation to the Nuba or the Noba, the Nubidades, right? The people of the Middle Nile Valley, what was then ancient Kush, or late Meroitic Kush, I should say. And so 2 victory stelae established by the Aksumite king Ezana. In the Ezana stele, the Nubidades are referred to as the Noba. And according to the inscriptions, they had settled in the Nile Valley in the region of Meroe and its environs. The stelae are dated between 328 and 360 CE, the period in which Ezana was emperor of Aksum. The first of the 2 stelae consists of a monolithic granite. On one side, there's a Greek inscription, and the reverse side includes 2 inscriptions, one of the ancient Aksumite language of Ge'ez, written in the South Arabian script, and the other Ethiopic. The Greek inscription declares that Ezana was king of various polities, including the modern regions of Ethiopia, South Arabia, and Southern Sudan. The inscription announces that Ezana was king of kings and the son of the invincible god Ares, which in Ethiopic it would have been Mahrem, the so-called war deity, right? The war divinity of the ancient Aksumite, Himyarite, and Sabaean empire, who was considered the son of Ishtar, which was a female divinity. Again, my focus on looking at the Ezana stele was because of a king that I studied, 5th century Sudan, King Silko, who left an inscription on a temple in Upper Egypt called the Temple of Kalabshet. And so I was comparing the language of the Silko inscription, which was a triumphant inscription. And in this inscription, he says, I'm the king of the Ethiopians and all the Nubians, and I fought with the Blimians, and God gave me the victory, and so forth. And so you see similar language in the Ezana stele and all three inscriptions, the Greek inscription, the Ethiopic, and the Sabian inscription. So I was led to this again because of the comparative analysis with the Silko inscription and Nubian king in 5th century Sudan. But yet what we see, what we're about to see in this stele, the one to the left, which is the monolithic granite, which has the three inscriptions, Greek, Sabian, and Ethiopic, they all give a very similar and unified, but also different perspective on who King Ezana was. We also see his transformation because it's only in the Sabian inscription where he mentions Christian theology and Christian terminology. In the Ethiopic and the Greek inscription, he does not. He's mentioning pre-Christian deities such as Mahram or the Greek equivalent Ares. For instance, the Greek inscription, and I'm just taking excerpts. I'm son of Ezana, son of Elamida, king of the Aksumites, also king of the Himyarites, the Ethiopians, the Sabaeans, and the Beja. I highlight those four just to give an idea of the geographic scope of the Aksumite kingdom under Ezana. The Himyarites are South Arabia. The Sabaeans are also South Arabia. The Beja are a group of pastorless people that stretch from Egypt all the way into Ethiopia. And then the Ethiopians here are referring to the Meroitic people, the Meroitic kingdom, right? The Cushites, right? And so he's giving you an idea of the expanse of the Aksumite state at this time, covering all these polities, and not only stretching again from the Meroitic Kush to South Arabia, right? But even having influence as far as Egypt, as far as Iran, as far as India and so forth, as we saw in the maps. The Gez inscription is similar. It mentions the same Aksum, Himyar, Saba, the Beja, and so forth. And in both inscriptions, again, there's no Christian language. There's no Christian terminology. The Lord of Heaven is referring to a pre-Christian deity. And again, of course, in the Gez inscription, and then of course, Ares is simply the Greek equivalent to the Himyarites, Ethiopic and Sabaean deity Mahram. Now it's in the Sabaean inscription where we see a shift from an appeal to the pre-Christian deities to explicit Christian language, right? The Lord strong and brave, the Lord Almighty in battle by the power of the Lord and by the grace of Jesus Christ, the Son of the Lord, the victorious in whom I believe, who has given me a strong kingdom by which I dominate my enemies, right? And then again, he lists that he's king of Aksum, Himyar, Saba, the coastal territory of the Arabs, the Beja, the Noba, the Kasu, right? And of course, others and so forth, right? And so, but what they all have in common, though, is that there is the affinity between kingship and divinity. And somehow the divinity is sanctioning the state and the king and the control over various territories. That is what they all have in common, the Christian inscription and as well as the two pre-Christian inscriptions in both Ethiopic and Greek. So we see that indeed Ezana makes a shift during his reign. And I don't have an example of it, but there's even archaeological evidence for this as well in terms of the coinage. The pre-Christian coinage that Aksum is producing, they're producing coins, has images of Mahram, or who the Greeks call Ares. And then you see coinage that changes to having Christian imagery on the coins. So Izana represents this shift, this transformation in the culture in the early to mid 4th century. Now, of course, this story is told by the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, who lives from around 380 AD to 440 CE. So he lives the late 4th, early 5th century. The story of the conversion of Odysseus and Frumentius and how they convert Izana to Christianity. The student of philosophy from Tyre, Frumentius, a colleague, possibly a brother of Odysseus, they were captured by Ethiopians in about 340 AD. So they were traders, right? So that map that I showed of the Periplus Ethiopian Sea, right, and all the trade networks, right? So they were traders, and they were caught by what's the word I'm looking for? Hijackers, pirates, quote unquote, so to speak. But somehow they became civil servants at the court of the Aksumite king, right? Whom Frumentius converted. On the death of the monarch, Izana, Frumentius joined the queen's court as the royal administrator and became tutor to the crown prince Izana. Frumentius was empowered to grant freedom of religious expression to visiting Christian merchants from the Roman Empire, right? Or at this time, they're talking about Byzantium, and was himself permitted to evangelize. After fulfilling his regency, Frumentius visited Saint Athanasius. Athanasius was a great patriarch and bishop of the Coptic Church in the 4th century. I'm trying to recall his dates from 4th to the early 5th century. But he battled because he lived during a time during the Arian controversy in the early Christian movement. And so for a while, Arianism, which said there was a time when the sun was not, I want to get into the whole theological debates going on in the 4th and 5th century in the early Christianity, but my point is that Arianism was a different philosophy that suggested that Jesus had not always existed or been consubstantial with quote unquote God the Father. And so Athanasius opposed that doctrine. He said, no, the Son always coexisted consubstantially with the Father. And so after Emperor Constantine died, the empire said, no, we don't agree with Athanasius. So they exiled him. For a very long time, he had to go on the run until another emperor came who was more amenable to his doctrine and so forth. So this is a long story. But my point is that Athanasius was key because he would then ordain Frumentius and make him bishop, and he returned to Ethiopia, convert Izana, and begin to establish and erect churches and so forth. Now, I think this is, I'm highlighting this, I think this is important because this would even happen in the late medieval, early modern era when the Portuguese come to Ethiopia, right? And I know Dr. Binyam has probably had more insight on that period, and wants to make Ethiopia a part of the Roman Catholic Church and become under the ecclesiastical and political dominion of the Roman Catholic Church and the Portuguese crown at that time. And this is the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken. But something like this was proposed even as early as the 4th century, right? The emperor who succeeded Emperor Constantine, who was anti-Athanasius, he proposed that the Ethiopian church should become a part of the Byzantine church, should become a part of the so-called Melkite or Chalcedon churches. And these churches were churches that argued a slightly different theology, right? They argued that Jesus had two natures, human and divine. The churches in the Nile Valley, Ethiopia, the church in Nubia, the church in Egypt, they said, no, Jesus has one nature, human and divine, right? Because they saw those two being a composite of a unified being, not two separate beings, right? Again, this is a lot of theological intricacies and details and the peculiarities that were going on in the early Christian movement, right? It wasn't any uniformity leading up to Constantine, and even after Constantine. There continued to be debate and
Excuse
diversity.
me, Salim.
Yes.
Can you start to wrap it up because we're running behind?
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And so here I just wanted you all to see that Emperor Constantius II is asking Izana and his brother Caesarus, right, to become a part of the Byzantine church. And of course, they decline, right? And he says, tells them, you are deserving of the same provident care as the Romans and desiring to show equal regard for your welfare. We command that the same doctrine be professed in your churches as in theirs, right? So he's saying, look, you should join with the Melkite churches of Byzantium and become a part of us, as opposed to maintaining your distinctiveness. Now, this is important because ecclesiastically, the Ethiopian Tawido Church would be a part of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt up until, someone help me, I think it's up until 1956, if I'm not mistaken, is when the Ethiopian Church becomes independent, if you will, ecclesiastically. But from this period all the way to the 1950s, the bishops of the Coptic Orthodox Church had ecclesiastical authority over the bishops in the church in Ethiopia. And I know that even the tomb of Emperor Haile Selassie, I think that's the Trinity of Holy Cathedral in Addis Ababa, there's a quarter in that church for Coptic clergy and Coptic bishops when they visit Ethiopia and so forth. So I will stop right here. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A when we're finished with this panel. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Salim, very much. Now we'd like for Yonatan to open up his view and get in here and do his thing. Wonderful presentation, Salim. Thank you very much.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you might be. And I just want to start by thanking the organizers of this roundtable and for focusing on Ethiopia and my work and the work of my colleagues whom you've just heard. And compared to the really great presentations that we saw, I feel like mine is going to be a little less exciting. What I'm going to do is really just talk about some of my research over the past few years and a little bit of the current book monograph that I'm working on, and try and tie that into the work and the legacy of Dr. Hansberry. And with that, I initially just here. I wanted to start initially with I guess a little bit of a shameless plug, but a recent handbook or a short introduction to Ethiopian history that I wrote together with Verena Krebs, who is a specialist of medieval Ethiopian history based in Bochum in Germany. But she was also trained, she did her PhD partly in Megale University in Tigray in Ethiopia as well. And I bring this, I wanted to start with this because in a lot of ways, I think that Dr. Hansberry's work, particularly in Pillars in Ethiopian History, anticipates a lot of what's going on in Ethiopian studies, where there's Dr. Hansberry was a bit ahead of his time on many points in terms of how he understood Ethiopian history, but particularly when it came to the question of trying to connect, trying to understand Ethiopia within the wider context of both Nile Valley civilizations, but also Red Sea trade networks, as Dr. Faraji just pointed out. And he does that quite well. But in addition to that, he also analyzes Ethiopian literature through that lens of how Ethiopic texts are entangled with texts that are produced in a bunch of different languages and in several different religious traditions, really going from the pre-Aksumite period all the way up into the medieval period. And in a way, I see this book that we published as kind of an extension of that. And I'm sure Dr. Hansberry would have really appreciated a lot of the new scholarship that's being produced that our book sources from in trying to tell the story of Ethiopia within the broader context. I wanted to initially highlight kind of how Dr. Hansberry's work is being extended in these types of scholarships. And then for the remainder of the presentation, I just wanted to highlight some of what I do in particular, which I think and I guess I'm going to try and find different examples in my work that I think highlight different aspects of Ethiopic literature, which is very difficult to summarize in a short amount of time. But I wanted to begin by contrasting early Ge'ez texts with medieval Ge'ez texts or medieval Ethiopic texts. And so one of the things that Dr. Hansberry touches on is really the story that Dr. Faraji just kind of laid out for us in terms of the production of Christian materials in Ethiopia subsequent to the quote-unquote conversion of Izana to Christianity. And so beginning as early as the 4th century up until the 7th century, you have the production of a lot of different texts, most of which are biblical texts in Ge'ez. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Garima Gospels, which are named after the Abba Garima monastery in Tigray, where they are found. And they constitute the earliest surviving illuminated manuscripts in the world. So not just in the context of Ethiopic manuscripts, but across early Christian manuscripts in general, including Greek manuscripts. And so you have these really important examples of early Ethiopic manuscript production that is very important for reconstructing the earliest forms of a bunch of different biblical and parabiblical texts, but also for reconstructing early Jewish and Christian history, both in Ethiopia and outside of Ethiopia. And then what happens subsequent to the Aksumite era is, well, I'm sort of skipping several centuries, but you have this moment of a literary renaissance in Ge'ez manuscript productions. And what's different this time is that I guess the diaspora communities of Ethiopian monastics that are now that over the course of the medieval period end up in settling in several places in Nubia, many different monasteries in Egypt and in the Levant, and especially in Jerusalem, but also places as far north as Cyprus, and by the time you get to the late medieval period, as far northwest as Rome. And in those contexts, you have the production of a huge range of literature. And so if you contrast the early Ethiopic texts with the medieval, what you find is that there's quite a lot of continuity, that a lot of the books that are translated into Ethiopic in the ancient period are, again, retranslated, but this time almost exclusively from Arabic, given the context in which these texts are being translated is in the literary renaissance that first emerges in Coptic churches in Egypt, which are now speaking Arabic by that point, and then their translations into Ethiopic. And then another distinguishing feature is the translation of several different works that are still translated within the kind of institutional life of Orthodox Coptic, Orthodox and Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, but which are now kind of translating for the first time into Ethiopic a lot of the works that had existed in classical Greek antiquity outside of the parameters of early Christians. So these historical works are what my particular focus is. But in addition to that, I've also looked at several other areas of Ethiopic texts, and I'll say a little bit about my book project, which is still kind of an ongoing revision of my dissertation work, which was looking at the works of a Roman Jewish author who wrote in Greek in the 1st century, whose name was Josephus, and he wrote several works that have a really long and kind of complicated reception history, where his two primary works, which are the Jewish War and the Jewish Antiquities, which are written around 75 to 94 CE, are then translated into Latin, and then a kind of conglomeration of a bunch of different texts is then produced in Hebrew in the 10th century in southern Italy. And this text, even though it's produced for Jews, it becomes really significant for both Christians and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, including in Cairo, where Judeo-Arabic or Jewish Arabic version of that text and Coptic Arabic of that text is produced. And so what my dissertation focused on is the Coptic Arabic version, i.e. how Coptic Christians writing in Arabic rework the Hebrew text, and how they began to receive it really as part of the kind of biblical canon of Coptic Christianity at the time. And the title of the book varies depending on which manuscripts you're looking at, and the dating of the text has never really been fixed. But most manuscripts refer to it as the Kitab Akhbar al-Yahud, which means something like the book of the history of the Jews, or kind of the report on the Jews. And this is where the Ethiopic title for the text comes from, Zena Ihud, which is often just translated as history of the Jews. And so Zena Ihud is a close translation of the Arabic translation of a Hebrew text, and the Hebrew text itself has kind of an interesting reception history. So if you're interested in a good kind of printed version of this text, as opposed to dealing with manuscripts, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has published a copy of it, which is difficult to get outside of Ethiopia, but it does have the Ge'ez text side by side with an Amharic translation. And part of the reason why I focus on this work is because it really covers a lot of important moments in in the history of antiquity, and in the way that these are received and understood in the medieval Ethiopic context. So it starts with the interesting story of how the world is divided between Noah's sons, but it also has stories on the founding and early history of Rome, the histories of the Persian kings, a story about Alexander the Great, the Ptolemaic takeover of Egypt, the translation of Septuagint, a bunch of other things dealing with the Maccabean period, or the moment when Jews take over, or recapture, I should say, Jerusalem and Judea from the Greeks and the Seleucids. But then in addition to that, the coming of the Romans to Judea and the conquest of that region by Pompey, and the stories about Herod the Great, etc. So you can kind of imagine how this would have been really important for Coptic and Ethiopian Christians and historians and church leaders at that time to get their hands on these types of stories for the first time, because it really contextualizes the origins of Christianity, and in a way, Josephus is the most significant source for what was happening in the Greek and Roman world, and in the Roman Empire, right before and right after the emergence of Christianity in the first century. Okay, I'll just skip over these parts for lack of time, and say a little bit about and I guess a few more shameless plugs as far as some of the work I've published on this. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, there's a short article that I published in Classical Receptionist Journal that kind of gives you an idea of how the translation history of Ethiopic texts unfolds over time, because Ethiopic literature is drawing from so many different languages. There's actually quite a lot to unpack and untangle. So in this journal article, I take a look at a story about a mother who is forced to kill and consume her own son, which becomes this really sensationalized story that becomes really famous as a part of the stories of Josephus, and in it I deal with the differences between all the different texts. So you can kind of see how, beginning on the left here, how Josephus is telling that story in the Greek, and how that story is changed ever so slightly at each stage of reception. So it's changed at the level of the Latin and the Hebrew, the Judeo-Arabic, which more or less is the same as the Coptic Arabic. And then I also try and highlight what's different in the Ethiopic version as well. So I won't get into the details of this particular text, but one of the points I'm trying to bring out, or the argument that I'm looking to make in this particular article, is how the slight literary changes that are made actually impact the way that the narrative unfolds, and how radically different the story of this mother becomes by the time you get to the Ethiopic text. So I can say a little bit more about that whole thing in the Q&A if people are interested. And I've done work on a few other medieval Ethiopic texts that people might be interested in, one of which is the Maccabean, which is sometimes in English just referred to as the Ethiopic books of Maccabees, which is sort of a misnomer, because these are not the same books as the Greek books of Maccabees. Actually, the Maccabean constitute the only known example of indigenously produced biblical texts. So even though the Maccabean are part of the Ethiopic canon, they are not translations of former biblical texts, as in every other case in the biblical canon. But in this case, they're actually written in Ethiopia, and they're the only kind of, they are unique to the Ethiopian biblical tradition. And I have a short chapter and an edited volume sort of explaining what the books are about and how they differ from the Greek books of Maccabees, why the Greek books of Maccabees never make it to Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia has pretty much every other book and then some in its canon, which is also a really interesting story. But if you're interested in that, this is a good place to start. And then a really famous text in medieval Ethiopic literature, one which William Leo Hansberry talks about as kind of the opening to his Pillars in Ethiopian History, is the Kubra Nagas. And this is also another really complicated work. And one of the things that I appreciate quite a bit about the discussion of the Queen of Sheba in Pillars in Ethiopian History is, again, the way that Dr. Hansberry is reading it in the context of other literary traditions that are impacting the way that the Aksumite ideology of kingship and dynasties is emerging, as well as later medieval notions of how the Queen of Sheba is understood, not just in biblical Ethiopic traditions, but also in Southern Arabia and Yemenite and in Islamic traditions. And that's one of the things that I think it now marks, it's a characteristic feature of how the Kibernegist is understood. It's understood as a synthesis of a bunch of different literary traditions that are circulating around East Africa and South Arabia over the course of several centuries. And there's a recent article of mine that is a good illustration of how this works. So I talk quite a lot about how there are these stories about how evil emerges on earth that are influenced in part by biblical stories of things like Adam and Eve in the garden, etc., but also pick up on parabiblical, aka pseudepigraphic texts written in Greek and Latin during the late antique period, but also draw from the story of Adam and Satan, who's referred to as Iblis in the Quran, and how the Kibernegist is really taking all of these various Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions and rewriting these stories in a relatively unique way, and in a way that that connects the question of evil and the question of salvation with Ethiopia's new place in kind of the biblical story as the new Zion, or the new resting place of the glory of God, aka the Ark of the Covenant. So that's another kind of example of the type of work I do. Oh, and I also have done some stuff on Zain Askinder. Zain Askinder, so Alexander the Great traditions are next to the Bible, kind of the most popular, and that's also true for Ethiopic literature. And there are stories about Alexander the Great kind of all over the place. And I can say a little bit more about that in terms of what I've done, again, in the Q&A. But hopefully that gives you sort of a general broad idea of the scope and the range of post-Aksumite Ethiopic literature, and in particular the historiographical tradition within that canon or within that literary tradition. Thank you for your time.
Yonatan, first of all, don't ever say that, oh, my presentation is not going to be exciting. Man, it was
Yeah.
so exciting.
Yes. Yes.
I don't have any pictures.
And let me say that all the presentations, oh man, I could just cry because you all just really, really brought it. We've been excited to have some panels on Ethiopia for a while now, and you all just did such a fantastic job. I just really want to thank you all for doing this. Before we move on, I'm going to introduce our moderators who've been behind the scenes, but they're going to come out front to help us with the Q&A. So we have Janelle Marshall. Janelle is a PhD student in anthropology at Purdue University. She specializes in bioarchaeology and environmental microbiology. She investigates human bacteria coevolution and the relationship between bone infection and exposure to tetracyclines from dietary sources in the ancient Nile Valley. Her current research focuses on the relationship between archaeology and local communities in the Nubian region of northern Sudan. Next, we have Ms. Sydney Pickens. Sydney holds a BA in archaeology and art history from Columbia University. She's an archaeologist, a dancer, and an educator specializing in K-12 archaeology, educational programming, and curriculum design. As archaeology educator for archaeology in the community, she developed a curriculum focusing on ancient Nubia that teachers could implement in their classrooms. And I will add that Sydney is at the University of Memphis studying, well, it's not called Egyptology, what is it, ancient?
I'm in the art history department,
Okay.
studying Egyptian art and archaeology.
All right, okay. And Jasmine, who said she's going to stay off screen because there's no questions in YouTube, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Jasmine Smith is a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. She received her MA from the Institute of Fine Arts and an MS from the University of Michigan School of Information, where she studied library, archive assessment, and digital curation. Her research interests include the study of ancient Egyptian tomb painting, archaeological data curation and preservation, and collections management within museums. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to our moderators for the Q&A, and actually everybody can turn on their cameras, well, except Jasmine, who doesn't want to, for the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you all for these amazing presentations. I was myself taking lots of notes and just getting really excited always by the work that we do here in the Hansberry Society. I'm gonna jump right in. One of our first questions in the chat is from Emmanuel Adama. He is asking about I'll just read it. The Sabaean influence is often emphasized concerning the development of Ethiopian civilizations. Can the panelists highlight some Ethiopian influences on Arabian civilizations? Examples, the Manfred Group suggested that the Codex of the Mushaf is of Ethiopian origin. Yeah. So any thoughts on that?
Okay. Dr. Binyam.
You can go ahead, Salim, if you want to start first.
I would just want to say that I rely a lot on Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who's an Ethiopian Jew. He was at I think Princeton for a very long time, but back in the 60s. In fact, he founded the African American Studies program there, right? Well before it would become what it is. And then in recent years, I'm not sure, please help me out, he's been at Princeton leading an Institute for Semitic Languages and Culture and so forth. And so he prioritizes the Ethiopian side, if you will, of that interconnection with South Arabia and so forth. In his interpretation of the script, he sees it as indigenous to Ethiopia, and what would emerge in South Arabia took its point of reference from Ethiopia. And he also, which of course I didn't go into it, but he also talks about the connection between Proto-Sinaitic and Gez, right? And a lot of people have missed that connection entirely because it is important to understanding the birth of Semitic languages and scripts. And so I tend to side with him. Of course I would, right? That's he's one of the experts in that area in terms of prioritizing Ethiopia with regard to Sabian influence and so forth.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the other interesting things about Ephraim Isaac, I believe he's half Yemeni, half Ethiopian, and so he's I would say just as invested and interested in ancient South Arabian as he is in Ge'ez and Ethiopic, and yeah, I would say he's definitely kind of one of the prominent voices, but more recently, an individual who asked that question brought up Manfred Kropp, who has pointed out some of the influences on uh, Islamic origins from the perspective of the Aksumite kingdom and Ethiopic as both kind of as a religious and linguistic influence on what was happening in the Arabian Peninsula in the early days of Islam. And so there's quite a lot of studies now that are or let me put it this way: the influence of Ethiopic on the language of the Quran is a growing field. Metsahaf being the term for a book that's adopted in Islamic traditions is just one example among others that shows that the Aksumites that were present in the Arabian Peninsula had this linguistic influence on people that came to constitute the early Islamic community. But you can also look at several different stories, both in the Quran itself and later Hadith traditions about the Aksumites that demonstrates the extent to which they were influential. So everything from like the story of Abraha, who was sort of the last Aksumite ruler in South Arabia, who's mentioned in the Quran, to these kind of stories about the Ethiopian or the Aksumite rulers who are referred to as Najashi, or kind of an Arabization of the Ethiopian term Nugus, which just means king. So there's quite a lot there that I think is becoming more and more part of the picture in scholarly reconstructions of the emergence of Islam.
Thank y'all. This next question is probably for you, Helena, but feel free, everyone, to chime in. So the question is, recent analysis of baboon remains suggests that Punt may be located in Ethiopia, possibly at the same site as Autolus. Have there been any recent findings to support this?
Thank you so much for that question. As an archaeologist, I'm always looking at this thing. So the land of Punt, again, has been very complex in terms of understanding it. But the current understanding is it's a large area than modern day Ethiopia. It probably included, the whole Horn of Africa, even southern part of modern day Sudan. But again, because of the location of the animal species, we know for sure, the baboon species directly came from the Ethiopian highlands, for example. And in my research from pre-Aksumite site, I did find a baboon remain, for example, which was made probably for export through Adolis, which is the ancient Red Sea port of the pre-Aksumites and Aksumites. So it's a very natural route for all the exotic animals being exported out from Africa. So the short answer is yes. And we're getting more and more evidence. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Our next one is for Dr. Faraji. Says, thank you for your presentation. Can you share your sourcing of the Ethiopian Bible? But I think I saw in the chat you directed that to.
Yeah, I defer to Dr. Binyam because a few months ago, we exchanged emails and he provided some information because I had a colleague inquiring about the Ethiopian Bible. And so, but I know that, I was just looking at maybe 10 minutes ago an Ethiopian Bible on Amazon written by Asher, I remember. And so, maybe Dr. Binyam can talk about I don't know, the reliability of these books on Amazon versus, the textual tradition. So, but I'll defer to Dr. Binyam.
Yeah, I think Dr. Faraji, the book you're thinking of, I forget the last name, but yeah, it's the first 8 books in the Hebrew Bible, or like the Ethiopic translations of the first 8 books from the Hebrew Bible. And they're based on a small number of manuscripts, but so the advantage is that it's relatively accessible because you can get it from Amazon. But the disadvantage is that it's not a very good representative of the Ethiopic manuscript tradition, which is actually like one of the more complex and kind of large textual traditions in all of Christianity, and so it's really difficult to get a good representation really of any biblical book in Ethiopia just because of the fact that the Bible has been produced and reproduced in the Ethiopian highlands for something like 1700 years. But having said that, I will say that some of that picture is beginning to change. And so one place I would recommend if you're interested in sort of getting a very good picture of Ethiopic biblical traditions is the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament, which is an ongoing project that was started, I would say a little over a decade ago, maybe about 15 years ago, in collaboration with a bunch of different scholars from Ethiopia, from the US and different parts of Europe, and particularly in Germany. And a lot of what they're finding, they're putting online. So if you Google the textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament, you'll be able to find their output. And the goal, I think, there is to be able to reproduce a critical edition of the Ethiopic Old Testament that will have with it an analysis of, again, this really vast and really complicated textual history of the Bible. And then I wanted to say something else. There are certain books for which you can find really good representations. So Mersha Alaheng is an Ethiopian scholar who has published both a critical edition of the Book of the Genesis, as well as a translation of the Andemta commentary tradition, which is the Ethiopian biblical commentary tradition that's indigenous to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. And that should be relatively accessible as well, although I'm assuming you'd have to find it in some university library, but that would be another kind of example of where to find a published form of the Ge'ez Bible that's also like a good representation of the manuscript evidence.
Go ahead, Solange.
Hey, so I just wanted to chime in and say, I put 2 things in the chat and I'll add the third one as soon as I'm done speaking, but there are at least 3, well, there are many very large Ethiopic manuscript collections in the United States. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, somewhere in the center of the country, has really accessible digitized versions that you can look at online. If you're in California, UCLA has one very large Ethiopic manuscript collection in the Young Research Library on campus in their special collections section. Catholic University in Washington, D.C. also. I don't know how accessible it is, but they got a very large donation. And then, of course, there's Princeton, which also has a really big collection of Ethiopic manuscripts. And a lot of these are digitized, and you can just go online and have a look at those.
And then I believe I saw Ben might have had, there it goes. We see you, Ben.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that with translating any of these ancient texts, I think fundamentally and bottom line, and I think Dr. Binyam would acknowledge this, that you need to learn Ge'ez and read it in the original. That would help a lot because they're just things that will not properly translate out from the Ge'ez into English. You know, I know you noticed Dr. Binyam in Ben Sirach, right? In the introduction of Ben Sirach, he says what? Those things translated from Hebrew into another language do not have the same meaning or effect in them. And so it's almost, you want to really, I think for me, to get the fun out of reading ancient texts, you dive into it with the original language, and then you'll be like, oh, wow, you mean tell me it doesn't really say that in English? And it means this. So I just want to throw that out there as my thought, my comments. Thank you.
And also just to just to clarify, because just for our audience in the community, Dr. Bingham, there's about 20 or more Bibles, Ethiopian Bibles on Amazon. It's saying the full complete Ethiopian Bible. You are stating that those Bibles are not based upon, they may be helpful for popular access, but they're not based upon the manuscript tradition in Ethiopia.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yeah, it really sort of depends what you're looking for. I do think quite a bit is lost when you're moving from the original language to translations, to echo what Dr. Ben Levi was saying. But then in terms of what's available, I think there's sort of a question as to whether someone is looking for the published versions of the Ge'ez Bible versus what's in the manuscripts. And I think the problem with the published versions of Ethiopic manuscripts is one, the manuscript tradition itself is one of the most complicated and kind of oldest manuscript traditions. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to produce one that's representative of like of the way that the text lives in that textual tradition, i.e., in the way that the text is understood historically in Ethiopia. It's hard to get a version of that. So most of the time what you end up getting are published versions that will rely on one or two manuscripts. But that's not to say that those aren't useful in any way. It's actually, as long as you're aware of what you're looking at, and as long as you're aware of some of the limitations and understanding that that these texts have sort of a dynamic and ever-evolving life in Ethiopian history, then I think it's actually fine to read it in that context. But also, like, if you're interested in kind of digging deeper, there are published versions of the text that are being produced now that I think are a lot more helpful in helping people understand just how complicated something like one biblical book can be in terms of its evolution throughout Ethiopian history.
Thank you all for those thoughtful responses. You kind of spoke to this already, I think, but just to get in a little bit more into the weeds of it, do you all want to speak to like what are the like most major misalignments when we're looking at translated versions as opposed to looking at into their original language. Yeah. And if you feel like you've already covered it at length, then that's fine as well too. We can keep pushing.
Yeah, so I mean that's a really interesting question. So I mean I think um yeah, I would say that this is something that again Dr. Ben Levi hit on, but what one of the things about the Ethiopian textual traditions is oftentimes you don't just get the Ethiopic translation, you get a kind of a commentary on how that text was understood in that particular context, whether it's like the medieval period of like 13th, 14th century Ethiopia, or it's later in the early modern period in like 18th and 19th century and forward. And the way that Ethiopians read the Bible and the way that they understood the Bible is sometimes quite radically different from the way that the Bible is understood in like Western kind of modern Western European languages and religious contexts. And I think that's particularly the case for the books of Enoch and Jubilees, or Kuhale and Henuk. And yeah, so I would say again, it's if you're really interested in that question, you kind of do have to go back to the manuscript traditions and begin to read both the Ge'ez translations and the sort of hybrid Ge'ez and Amharic commentaries on those texts.
Thank you. Janelle, do you want to hit the next one or should I?
Yeah, sure. So the next question is there any research on Ethiopian Christian missions to West and Central Africa?
I know I know this question also comes up for the Sudan, right? Especially the medieval Nubian church from Old Dangala, right? The Makurian kingdom in particular, because that was kind of the height and heyday of it. And so I know there's conversations about connections to West and the Sahel zone, you know, even the Sahara and so forth. So there is some work out there. I can't recall. I'm trying to think of. I can't recall the article, but I've seen some articles about, you know, those connections, in both modern, you know, what is now modern Ethiopia and the Sudan. I know a good place is I'm trying to is the Arab chroniclers, right, from the 7th century up until, you know, the late medieval period. There's constant referral to Abyssinia, the Habasha, the Noba, the Nuba, the Copt as well, and their influence in the Sahel zone, right? In terms of trade, commerce. I can't recall anything in terms of, you know, maybe theological transmission and the erection of churches and so forth. But I know that the Arab chroniclers, is you know, in fact, Bantini's Oriental sources about Nubia, he has collected them. And there's another book by an Islamicist, I'm trying to remember his name. He's compiled all of the Islamic sources, and it's hundreds. And you know, you can't read any of them and they're not talking about the Habasha. They're not talking about you know, the Nuba, the Nubidae, the Noba, the Cop, and so forth. And they're talking about it, you know, across the Balad es Sudan, right? The land of the blacks in particular, which stretches from, you know, Ethiopia all the way into Senegal, right? And so there's definitely interaction and interconnectivity and so forth, from a cultural perspective and from the perspective of trade and so forth.
Did you have some thoughts, Yonatan?
No, I was just gonna say I have no idea, but it's a really interesting question. But yeah, I don't know of any sources that discuss that. I would assume that it would be kind of post-medieval, early modern, if there are occurrences to that effect. But that's a really interesting question, though.
Hand it off to you, Deb.
All right, so yeah, so we have to close out now, but I want to thank everyone for their questions. I want to thank the panelists for their presentations and reflections. This has been just a wonderful, wonderful event. Before we close out, I would like to thank a few people. So I'd like to thank our sponsors who've been there for us basically since the beginning when we first started these events. So the Howard University African Studies Department, the Howard University Africana Studies Department, our friends at ASOR, AMSARC, the Nile Valley Collective, ASCAC, Archaeology in the Community, AAI, the Kemetic Institute, and the International Museum of Muslim Culture. So we want to thank you. We want to send a special warm greeting and much love to Miss Gail and Miss Kay Hansberry, who I know are watching. We have a hard time getting Miss Gail to come on camera every year, so I gave her a break this time, but we want to say hello to you and extend our love and our very much appreciation to you. And finally, someone asked, somebody in the Hansberry Society thought that we should give show our presentations that are up and coming. So as we close out, I want to show these slides. So as you can see, I have a presentation in about 35 minutes. So we're not done for the day. And Miss Sydney Pickens, she also will be on a panel this evening, starting at 6 p.m. Central Time. So if you're interested in either of those, you can take a quick picture, click the QR code to register. Let's see. We have a couple of presentations or lectures that are in person coming up. As you can see, I'm out of here. I'll be in Jackson, Mississippi on Thursday, speaking on William Leo Hansberry and his connection basically to Mississippi because they want to know that information. And I'm trying to convince them to, have a Zoom link or at least live stream it on YouTube. So if we're able to get that done, I'll make sure that the link is posted on our website and our social media. And Solange has a presentation coming up on March 8th at the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana, California. You can go onto their website if you're interested in attending. If you're not a member of RC or the Bowers Museum, then there is a fee to enter. And there's also a fee for the recording if you like that. And two other things we have. So we have several members that are members of other organizations that have conferences that are coming up, and they're serving as the organizers for panels. So this one is for SAFA, which is the Society of Africanist Archaeologists, that will be holding their conference in Portugal, July 21st through 25th. And Helina Woldekiros is one of the organizers for this particular panel on landscapes of investment, urban rural dynamics in Northeast and East African communities. So if you are an archaeologist and you're interested in presenting on this panel, working with this session, you can get in contact with Helina to get more information about how to submit papers or to submit an abstract. And finally, 2 more Hansberry members, Iman Nagy and Anissa Malvozan, who's online. They are hosting a panel for the next ASOR annual meeting, which will be in Boston in November. And their panel is interconnectivity and exchange with Northeast Africa. And so if you'd be interested on presenting on that panel, you can also reach out to them. You can, if you are interested in either panel, you can email the Hansberry Society email on our website, and then we make sure that your message gets in contact with, we'll connect your message to the appropriate person. So that is it for me. All right.
That title is tight, Dad.
Which title?
From the lowlands of Mississippi.
Oh yeah, I had to get a little
the highlands. That's a nice title.
Yes. So again, we want to thank all of you for coming and spending your morning and afternoon with us. Just remember that as we close out, we want to always remember our brothers and sisters in Sudan who are suffering for this war that will not end. And so we pray for them. We want them to know that we love them. We keeping our eyes on them. We will not turn away. We want accountability for this war. We're also have in our hearts love and appreciation for the Ethiopian people and the things that they've been going through for the past few years, and our brothers and sisters in Eritrea as well. So we just want to lift all of our brothers and sisters up to let them know that we love them, and we pray for their safety, and we pray for peace. And with that, we'll say goodbye.